I don't just talk about other people's stuff, I also make my own. Books in particular. To date, I have 4 books you can check out on Amazon. Operation Red Dragon: The Daikaiju Wars Part 1, Occult Mafia, Emerald of Maddox City, and the short story collection Assorted Absurdities, Tales of Kaiju Punk and Other Genres. Hop on down to the description for Amazon links to all 4 books. Enjoy whichever ones you read, and enjoy the video.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am the Omni viewer, and this is probably the closest I'll ever get to touching anything regarding the Rings of Power. I had determined a while ago that I was just going to avoid that as much as I could because, well, it was looking like it was going to be a disaster from the beginning in just about every sense of the word, and I've got better things to do with my time. If I want to spend a lot of time on something related to J.R.R. Tolkien, I'll read the books or watch the extended cuts of the movies again, because the extended cuts are the only cuts that matter. Anyway, I wasn't going to touch on this whole controversy either before or after. And after, it's pretty much exactly what you would expect it to be because it's the same thing that's been going on for 5 or 6 years now at this point. But I came across this particular tweet that I felt like I had to say something about. It does regard the Rings of Power, but it's such an odd argument. Well, I'll just put it up on the screen for you, and I'll be keeping it there for most of the video so you can see it for yourself and read along with me as we go. And I considered censoring this guy's name, but his thing is already out there for people to see, so I don't really see the point of it. But I will say, don't harass this guy. Don't seek him out to do that. That's not going to get anywhere good. Michael Harriot is this individual's name, but leave him alone. I'm not making this video to attack him either, actually. I believe that in a debate, a proper debate anyway, you target the argument, not the individual making the argument. Target the argument, not the opponent. That was the better way to say it. So, all of this that I'm about to say is focused entirely on the argument he makes. What does he say, though? Let's read along. So Zorro, Fu Manchu, Charlie Chan, Goku, the Prince of Persia, the King of Siam, Othello, every Egyptian pharaoh, the Lone Ranger, Tonto, Gandhi, Pocahontas, Moses, Noah, and Jesus were white, but a Negro Hobbit or a Black Targaryen isn't faithful to the source material. Got it. The implication here, which is dripping with sarcasm, is trying to not only call the other side of the argument racist, but also call them hypocrites, stating that we have a list of characters who are ethnically not Caucasian, yet are portrayed by Caucasian actors, and yet for some reason people are okay with that, but not okay with seeing non-Caucasian individuals in an adaptation of Middle-earth. Well, that is an interesting argument to make, not a surprising one, but does the argument actually hold up to scrutiny? That's what I'm here to determine. Alright, so let's make sure we understand the 3 claims being made in this argument, because there are 3 claims. Claim number 1 is that every individual in this list, be he a fictional character or a historical figure, is not Caucasian. Claim number 2 is that every character on this list is played by Caucasian actors in adaptations. And claim number 3 is that everyone is okay with those portrayals, but not okay with black people in Middle-earth. Those are the 3 claims that are being put forward here. Now, that last one, that everyone is okay with it, is quite a blanket statement to make. One that can't really be proven, especially because its main argument is that if you don't like something, you're a racist. It's an argument that we've learned by this point you can't really argue against. After all, if somebody accuses you of racism these days, they're not looking for you to prove that you're not racist, they're just looking for you to admit that you are, because they've already decided that you are. I'm not racist, but I don't think that will matter to anyone who's going to take a hard line against what I'm about to say in this video. I just want it on record, though. Anyway, does the list itself actually work? Does it actually support the claim? Is it in fact true? Let's go through it and see. So we begin with Zorro, probably acting on the assumption that Zorro is Latino. And yes, I said Latino. If Zorro were female, I would say Latina. You will never hear the version with an X at the end pass through these lips unless I'm being incredibly sarcastic, because I actually respect other cultures. Okay, so assumption here is that Zorro is Latino. Is he though? Well, first we have to make something very clear. When most people say Latino or Latina or the other one, they're referring to people from Mexico or Central America in some way. The original Zorro stories, however, are not set in Mexico or Central America. They are set in California, specifically at a time when California was a Spanish territory before it joined the Union. So you can sort of see that there would be a population in that region that today would certainly be called Latino slash Hispanic slash Mexican slash whatever. But does that apply to Zorro himself? Zorro, the character, well, his secret identity is Don Diego de la Vega, a Spanish nobleman. Some versions of the story even have him starting out in Spain and going to California. Now, whether he comes directly from Spain or just can trace his lineage there, the implication is that Don Diego has Caucasian ancestry, because the Spanish were not considered Latino. There's a line to be drawn there. Ergo, the original Zorro, Don Diego de la Vega, is white. Now, you might also bring up, wait a minute, Omni, what about Antonio Banderas playing Zorro in The Mask of Zorro? And yes, The Mask of Zorro is a good movie. However, let us not forget that Antonio Banderas does not actually play the original Zorro in that story. He plays a new character who is being given the mantle of Zorro by the original Don Diego, himself played by Anthony Hopkins. Now, that movie demonstrates that there is nothing wrong with someone of Latino descent playing Zorro, and in fact it can work incredibly well. Fans will accept it. Even Zorro purists love The Mask of Zorro. So nobody is saying that Zorro cannot be Latino, but to claim that he never was white to begin with, like this list is claiming, that is inaccurate. So we're off to a rough start here. Let's move on to Fu Manchu and Charlie Chan. I'm going to count them together because the issue regarding them is basically the same. And at the risk of tipping my hand here, these two being on the list is the closest Mr. Harriet comes to actually getting the point across. Fu Manchu and Charlie Chan are, of course, of Asian descent and are actually two different sides of the same coin. Fu Manchu was conceived as a negative Chinese caricature. Charlie Chan was originally conceived as an alternative to that. Still somewhat of a caricature, but in more of a positive direction rather than a negative one. However, when adapted to screen, they're more often portrayed by white actors in yellowface than by Asian actors. And this is why I say this is the closest the list comes to actually making the point, because, well, that's not a good practice. It's not as if Hollywood was lacking for Asian actors, mind you, or the resources to actually find them. In the silent era and going into the early 1930s, Anna May Wong was a headliner actress. Key Luke, later on in the 40s, was popular in movie serials. But when it came time to make the big budget movies of the 30s and 40s, and you wanted to do stuff like Fu Manchu, we instead went with Boris Karloff in makeup, which, again, not a good practice. So people in yellowface, yes, that's an issue. But you may note that I said this is the closest the list comes to making the point. I never actually said it gets to the point. That's because there are other factors to consider. First of all, let us not forget that one of the claims made by putting this list forward is that people are okay with these portrayals. And the thing is, they're not. The movie I alluded to in which Boris Karloff plays Fu Manchu is The Mask of Fu Manchu. I have seen that movie. It is vile. It is an incredibly racist movie. Even compared to the original books, it's racist. And the books are not known for being racially sensitive. So if the movie is worse, that's really saying something. But the thing is, I'm not just saying that from the perspective of someone in the 21st century. Even back in the 1930s, the movie was reviled for its racial caricatures and depictions. I repeat, back in the 1930s, when that sort of thing was far more common. They hated it back then. So, this is not a film that people liked. People were not okay with how it was done. Now, later on, when Fu Manchu was played by Christopher Lee in a series of films in the 60s and 70s, that's still not considered a good thing, mind you, but more people are allowed to give those movies a pass because they're not reveling in racism. Outside the yellow face itself, the movies are just sort of campy schlock, and nobody finds any reason to be offended by them outside of that detail. So they're just escapism. They're still not really looked upon favorably for that practice, but they still are not considered as vile as the one Boris Karloff made. And also, for the record, Boris Karloff did not like The Mask of Fu Manchu either. So again, this goes against the tweet's claim that people are okay with seeing characters like Fu Manchu portrayed by white actors, when in fact we are actually not. And in case you're wondering why I haven't said that much about Charlie Chan at this point, it's because Charlie Chan actually was portrayed by an Asian actor. He was actually portrayed by Key Luke in an animated series from Hanna-Barbera, The Amazing Chan and the Chan Clan. It's a pretty good show, I recommend it. So, again, you're making the absolute claim that all of these characters have always been portrayed by white people. Charlie Chan doesn't quite fall into that role. Next up is Goku. Now, I know he can't possibly be referring to Goku from the various Dragon Ball anime series and movies, because in those he is clearly Asian and depicted by Japanese seiyuu. Granted, he's dubbed over by Caucasian voice actors in English, but that's voice acting. Nobody bats an eye at that anymore these days, unless apparently it's The Simpsons. So why is Goku on the list? He must be referring to Dragon Ball Evolution, a movie that nobody likes. Dragon Ball Evolution was a disaster. People lambasted that movie almost from the beginning, much like they were doing with Rings of Power because of how it looked. And part of the reason why they were doing it was because the movie was whitewashing the cast. It turned Goku into a generic Caucasian Californian 20-something and thought it could get away with it, but it didn't. This is a weird one to include because, again, the claim is that people are okay with this sort of thing, and we're not. Dragon Ball Evolution was an objective failure on every front. So why include Goku on the list? It's kind of weird. Unless you are counting the voice actors, in which case it's dubbing. Originally, he's portrayed by the Japanese seiyuu, so what's the big deal? The Prince of Persia. Now, again, I'm assuming they must be referring to the movie here, wherein Prince Dastan was played by Jake Gyllenhaal. Now, admittedly, Jake Gyllenhaal doesn't necessarily look Persian, but then again, he does have some Jewish ancestry, I believe, does he not? Which, in that case, there were Jewish people in the region which would be known as Persia in that period, so he can trace his ancestry back to that region. Technically meaning that it's not that inaccurate to cast him. But again, even if that's not accurate and Jake Gyllenhaal is as Aryan as they come, The Prince of Persia is yet another movie, much like Dragon Ball Evolution, that tanked and was not really accepted by the audience. So again, that's pointing more towards the idea of people not being okay with this sort of thing. So that's two different occasions in which, in order to support his claim, Mr. Harriet has cited abject failures of cinema. It's kind of interesting that those are the examples he chose to go with. We'll see if he comes up with any more as we move forward. The King of Siam. Aha! So, must be referring to the musical version of The King and I, in which Yul Brynner plays the King of Siam. Now, you do know Yul Brynner is not fully Caucasian, right? He's of Russian descent, it's true, and there is some Caucasian Russian heritage in there. But he's also got Mongolian and Roma heritage. So he's not completely Caucasian. Not Siamese, certainly. He wasn't necessarily the most accurate choice to play the King of Siam in that regard, but he still is not Caucasian. Not fully. So, kind of weird that you would be including him on that list. Maybe it's nothing. Othello. Oh, so we're reaching back now. Okay, this is going to take a little explaining. When William Shakespeare's Othello first debuted back in the 17th century, there weren't exactly that many black actors around. Othello, for those of you who don't know, is a tragedy about the title character, Othello, who is a Moor, which means he is dark-skinned. There are many, many lines throughout the play that refer to him as being black-skinned and therefore other to the white-skinned characters. To be clear, he's the sympathetic hero, and the villain, Iago, is just irredeemable. But the fact is, Othello was a black character, but when the show first debuted, he would have been played by a white actor in makeup meant to darken his complexion. Why is that? Well, as I said, back in that time period, you wouldn't have found that many black actors in England. I mean, there might have been black people there, yes, but they weren't necessarily going to be actors. Plus, this was a time when women weren't allowed to perform in the theater either, so young men who hadn't hit puberty yet were cast as women. Theater back then had a lot of restrictions and was really bizarre at times, but this particular inclusion here reeks of presentism, which is applying modern standards to a time well before those standards were even a concept, let alone starting to be discussed. When the show first debuted, was Othello depicted by a white actor in what would now be considered blackface? Yes. Did that practice last for a while? Yes. Is it still practiced today? No. Most legitimate productions of Othello, be they theatrical or cinematic, will cast a black actor in that role, because that's considered one of those roles black actors want to play. And they like Othello. The only time I can think of in more modern times where we would have seen somebody doing what the Shakespeare shows originally did was a BBC production in the 80s, I believe, when they were doing a string of adaptations of Shakespeare plays. And for some reason, rather than cast a black actor as Othello, they decided to go with a white actor in blackface. They claimed it was to recreate the original experience of the shows. I don't think a lot of people really bought that. There was a lot of controversy surrounding it, and that's the only time recently where that's been done. At least that's gotten any attention. So again, most of the time, these days certainly, the character is portrayed by a person who actually matches the physical description and is not portrayed by a white actor. And if it does happen, it's not received well by the audience or the critics or anyone. So again, we're finding that as he's putting forward these claims that people are okay with white actors portraying these non-white roles, it's not holding up to scrutiny. Moving on, we have every Egyptian pharaoh. Every Egyptian pharaoh, you say? That is an absolutism. And we already mentioned that Yul Brynner is not completely Caucasian. He played Ramses II in the Ten Commandments. So right there, the absolutism is taken down. Now, have there been other Egyptian actors, be they mythical or historical, who were portrayed by white actors? Yes. But that's on Hollywood. It's their practice. They could cast Egyptian actors in these roles, but they don't. That's because Well, I guess there are a number of reasons why. I don't want to get into too much of it because this video is already long enough. But that's just the practice. I suppose at this point you could say that nobody really bats an eye at it. Is that the same as saying they accept it, or that they would somehow balk at the idea of having an actual Egyptian person cast as an Egyptian pharaoh? Well, we can't exactly prove that until it happens, can we? Either way, though, he spoke in terms of an absolute, and Yul Brynner destroyed that absolute, so we'll move on to the next one. The Lone Ranger. Yeah, the Lone Ranger is white. The Lone Ranger has always been white. It's not even like with Zorro where I can understand where you might get the idea he's not. The Lone Ranger has always... Why? You know what? Maybe this one was put there by accident, because he actually wanted to get to the next guy, which is Tonto, and the Lone Ranger and Tonto are always considered kind of a package deal. Two characters who you just always think about together. So you put both of their names down, meant to only include one, but included both at the same time. So maybe that was a mistake. But for the record, I cannot think of a single iteration of the Lone Ranger where the Lone Ranger has not been a Caucasian cowboy. But let's move on to Tonto, which I'm pretty sure is the character he actually wanted to highlight. Why is he including Tonto? It has to be because of the Johnny Depp version. You know, this one. Again, we find ourselves looking at how he's once again citing a movie that people do not like and which was an abject failure as part of his example. People did not accept Johnny Depp as Tonto, folks. This was considered one of his biggest career missteps. From the moment we saw that image of him in the cracking gray face paint with a dead crow for a hat, everyone who saw it thought, oh, this is gonna be a disaster. And it was. My word. The Lone Ranger is considered one of the worst movies of all time, really. I think we're still in the part where we can say one of the worst movies of the past decade. But yeah, once again, we're looking at a case where he's citing a movie that people didn't like to somehow prove that they will accept non-white characters being played by white actors. Now, there have been other versions out there, but what many consider to be the most iconic version of Tonto to be adapted to the screen is the version played by Jay Silverheels, who is in fact a Native American. I should say was, because I believe he's passed away by now, but he was an actual proper Native American. Still spoke in the broken English dialect, but he was authentic. That's the version of Tonto most people think of, even to this day, when they think of the character. They don't think of Johnny Depp unless they are thinking of ways not to adapt Tonto. So again, it's weird that you would focus on that, but not the other version. You know, there's cherry picking, and then there's trying to pass off rotten cherries as ripe ones. That's been happening so much on this list. Who's next? Gandhi. You mean Gandhi as portrayed in the biopic featuring Ben Kingsley? Because if you do, Ben Kingsley's birth name is Krishna Pandit Banji. At least that's how it looks like it's pronounced. I'm sorry if I got that wrong. But you may notice that's a very Indian sounding name, because Ben Kingsley is Indian. He's half British Caucasian on his mother's side, but on his father's side, he is Indian. That's one of the reasons he got the role of Gandhi. The other reason is that he looks like Gandhi. And it's kind of important when you're casting a historical figure that you cast someone who can at least pass for the historical figure. Ben Kingsley was almost a dead match for Gandhi. Not exactly, but close enough that if you put them side by side, you probably would believe that they were the same person. This is sort of like the Yul Brynner case again, where he's bringing up actors who aren't fully white, yet focusing on their whiteness. There's a really unfortunate implication you can read into that. It could read as him saying that if you have mixed heritage, if part of that heritage is white, that's the only part that matters, which is kind of skewing towards the direction of white supremacy. It's not a fully white supremacist sentiment, but saying that your white heritage is the most important thing about you is, you know what, I'm going to stop myself there. Point is, Gandhi was not played by a white actor. He wasn't played by a fully Indian actor, sure, but he was played by an actor who was at least partly Indian and looked the part, which is why he got the role. So again, doesn't really belong on the list if you ask me. Next is Pocahontas. Do you mean Pocahontas from the Disney adaptation? Voiced by Irene Bedard, who is Native American? I got it right in front of me. She's Inupiat and Cree and Métis, and yes, there's a little French Canadian in there, but she's mostly Native American. You know, there's a question that's been bothering me for a while now, and asking it runs the risk of me breaking my not making it personal rule, but at this point, I think it's completely fair of me to ask, how does he not know that? How does he not know who voiced Pocahontas in this movie? How does he not know so many of... It's just bothering me. And so we will move on to the rest of it. Moses, Noah, and Jesus. Much like with Fu Manchu and Charlie Chan, I'm going to count them all as one because we've got, once again, a similar thread connecting them all. The implication that they were all Jewish, and they all hailed from a region where they would have been much darker skinned due to the environment. You know, desert, near the equator, that sort of thing. Now, first of all, let me dispel the idea that being Jewish is a race. That's not the case. If you believe that Jewish people are a race unto themselves, you are buying into actual Nazi propaganda. That's where that comes from. Jewishness is a culture, it's a religion, it's an ethnicity at most, but it's not a race. You cannot tell a Jewish person just by looking at them in plain clothes. Case in point, Sammy Davis Jr. Even so, you can still be prejudiced towards Jews, and it still leaves us with the issue that the Jewish characters from the regions mentioned would have been darker complexioned than what we usually see in movies. Well, we can at least say that about Moses and Jesus. As for Noah, whether you believe the flood account is fact or fiction, you still have to accept in either case that the environment Noah would have come from pre-flood is different than the environment he would have wound up in post-flood. So we can't say for certain what his complexion would have been, but the implication is that he still has that Jewish heritage, because it's Old Testament / the Torah, you get the idea. So, we can set him as an outlier, but we still have Moses and Jesus to deal with. Why are these characters so often portrayed as Caucasian? And they have been portrayed as by Caucasian actors. I won't deny that. But what's the reason? Is it just because white people are whitewashing history? Actually, it's a little more complicated than that. But it will require a bit of a history lesson. Okay, so stick with me on this. Western culture's perception of biblical figures and events is largely influenced by classical art, mostly from the Renaissance, but also from the Romantic period and so forth. This was art that was painted in Europe by the great artists, painted and sculpted. There were various forms. But they often portrayed these characters as Caucasian as well. It wasn't just that they were portrayed as Caucasian, though. It was portrayed like these events took place in contemporary Europe. Contemporary for them. You look at these images and you will see that not only are the characters depicted within fair-skinned, they are also in then contemporary looking buildings with then contemporary looking objects and then contemporary attire. They were drawing from what was around them at the time. There was also the occasional UFO, but that's a completely different subject. Now, the reason for this is because these artists usually drew from life. They used models. They studied anatomy in order to get the details of their paintings and sculptures correct. And who was available for them to study at the time? Other native Europeans, other fair-skinned people. There were some dark-skinned people venturing into Europe at the time. I'm not going to say that it was completely closed off, but the thing is, it was not very common. And those who did venture into Europe at that time were most likely to be merchants or things like that. People who had better jobs to do as far as they were concerned than standing half naked on a pedestal holding a pose for 10 hours while some guy they didn't know stared at them and then stared at an easel. So since most of the options were other Europeans, that's what they drew from. And, as fate would have it, that made those paintings more appealing to the audience that would be seeing them by making it familiar. And it wasn't fueled by racial insensitivity. Cultural insensitivity and racial insensitivity weren't even really concepts back then. Not that prejudice didn't exist, mind you, but when people made their art, they weren't thinking, hee, I'm going to take these brown people and make them white in my painting in order to whitewash history. Ha ha! That wasn't the case. They were just drawing from what they were familiar with. And it's not even an exclusive practice to Europe. You know how I know that? Because this is a depiction of Jesus and the apostles from Ethiopia, in which you will note they all look Ethiopian. And here's another biblical scene from South Korea, where you'll note that the characters all look South Korean. Why? Because the Ethiopians and the South Koreans were drawing from the people they knew. They drew from their surroundings and depicted the art of these biblical events accordingly. Ergo, it's not that unheard of a practice. Unless you're going to try arguing that Ethiopians and South Koreans also did it because of racism. But I don't think that's the case. And so these pieces of biblical art ingrained themselves into Western culture's mindset and influenced the way our culture viewed these scenes for generations to come. Still do to a certain extent. And it had a direct impact on the movies. Actors were cast for biblical epics based on whether or not they resembled figures from those popular pieces of art that people knew. And I can prove it in at least one instance. If I can prove it in at least one instance, then you have to assume it holds true. Let's go back to the Ten Commandments. Do you know why Charlton Heston was cast as Moses? Because he looked like a popular statue of Moses. This statue in particular. Somebody thought, hey, if you slapped a beard on Charlton Heston, he would be a dead ringer for that statue. And it turned out he was. And I should probably mention who the people were that made that realization. They were the people who made the film. Jewish people. So, still ultimately a Jewish story. They approved 100% of these choices. Because, again, the actors looked the parts. And they wanted to stay true to what those sources they were drawing from looked like. Just so happens that the sources they were drawing from were already artistic adaptations in their own right. So what's the takeaway meant to be from this video? I think it's this. If you're going to discuss the Rings of Power in any capacity, take the time to actually look things up and make sure you've got your facts straight before you go shooting your mouth off. In fact, if you take the time to look up those facts, you may find the point you were going to make might not actually hold up before you even make it. But then again, don't just take my word for it. You have internet access if you're watching this video. Look this stuff up for yourself. See what you find.
Congratulations, you reached the end. If you enjoyed this video, you might want to consider supporting us on Patreon. Of course, the other way to support us is to go to Amazon and check out our books, Operation Red Dragon, The Daikaiju Wars Part 1, The Occult Mafia, Emerald of Maddox City, and Assorted Absurdities, Tales of Kaiju Punk and other genres. Also check the description for links to DeviantArt and other platforms we operate. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you next time.